Dust motes danced in the dim light of the Vatican's subterranean archives, settling on the shoulders of Elias as if trying to bury him alongside the forgotten histories. After decades of parsing through ancient Greek and Hebrew texts, the scholar felt like a hollow and weary shell. His faith, which had once burned like a roaring fire in his youth, had dwindled to a heap of gray ash. He was searching for something, though he no longer knew what, perhaps a sign that the God he served was more than just a character in a meticulously edited anthology of ancient folklore. The air in the vault smelled of ozone and the slow, inevitable decay of parchment. Beneath a stack of crumbling ledgers, his fingers brushed against a texture that felt distinct: cold, cracked leather. It was a journal, bound with an urgency that the official archives lacked. On its first page, written in a frantic, ink-stained hand, were the words, "The Five Veils." These were truths whispered to be too jarring for the Sunday pulpit, fragments of a divine reality so raw and unfiltered that they had been smoothed over by centuries of cautious translation. Elias felt a sudden, sharp prick of curiosity, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. The first veil mentioned the Rem. Modern readers might smile at the mention of unicorns in the King James Bible, picturing majestic, shimmering white horses with silver horns. But as Elias traced the original Hebrew, he felt a wave of unsettling realization. These weren't creatures of fairy tales. They were the Rem, massive, untamable wild oxen with horns like iron spears and a temperament of pure, unbridled fury. The ancient texts described a beast of such terrifying power that no man could hope to harness it. He leaned back, the shadows of the library feeling more oppressive. He realized then how much the modern world has sanitized the divine. We have turned a wild, dangerous strength into a nursery rhyme to make ourselves feel safe. In our quest for comfort, we had lost the holy wildness that once made men tremble before the heavens. Turning the page, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The journal detailed the account of the prophet Elisha found in the second book of Kings. It was a story of 42 youths who had mocked the man of God, only for 2 she-bears to emerge from the woods and tear them apart. This wasn't the peaceful, shepherd-like God Elias had been taught to love. It was a story of brutal, immediate retribution that defied modern sensibilities of mercy. He grappled with the passage, his eyes burning as he read. Where was the forgiveness? The inherent violence of the story felt like a betrayal of the peaceful deity he had spent his life defending. This story of the bears struck a nerve that had never truly healed. 20 years ago, Elias had stood over a casket much too small for his younger brother, who had been taken in a freak accident that shattered his family. He had spent the rest of his life asking a silent sky why some are struck down in an instant while others are spared. These biblical accounts of sudden, violent intervention weren't comforts. They were triggers. They reminded him that the hand of God could be as heavy as it was healing, and that divine silence was often the most agonizing answer of all. Before we continue this journey into the shadows of Scripture, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, as we prepare to peel back the next layer. Elias was about to snap the journal shut, his heart hammering with a mixture of anger and profound exhaustion. But as he shifted, a yellowed, brittle parchment slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the cold stone floor. It was a map scrawled with precise coordinates in the Levant, the heart of the Middle East. It spoke of the Nephilim, the giants who once walked the earth, and Elias knew his search for the truth had only just begun. The dust of the Levant was grit and heat, tasting of salt and old bone. Elias wiped his brow, his fingers trembling as he held the journal that had become his compass. Beside him, Sarah walked with the practiced ease of an archaeologist. She was a cynical companion, Her eyes narrowed against the glare, looking for anomalies in the sediment rather than signs of the divine. She didn't believe in the sacred. She believed in what could be carbon-dated and categorized. As they traversed a narrow path through sun-bleached rocks, Sarah chuckled, bringing up the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. To her, it was a ridiculous fable used to keep nomadic children entertained. She mocked the idea of a beast of burden finding its voice to argue with its master, as if the creator of all things would bother with the vocal cords of a lowly pack animal. But Elias didn't laugh. He saw a deeper, more painful truth in the ancient ink. To him, the donkey wasn't a comedic trope or a fable. It was the voice of the unheard. It was the creature that saw the angel with the drawn sword, while the man who claimed to be a prophet was blinded by ambition. Elias felt a kinship with that donkey. He had spent his life serving an institution, carrying the weight of their doctrines, only to realize he had been the one seeing the danger, while his superiors walked blindly toward the blade. Sarah's cynicism, he realized, was born of a deep-seated betrayal. As the sun cast long, bruised shadows, she spoke of the religious institution that had once been her home. They had used her expertise to validate their claims and then discarded her when her findings didn't fit their narrow narrative. They had tried to bury her career just as she buried the dead. In the shared silence, a fragile bridge of trauma formed between the scholar and the archaeologist. They were both refugees from a faith that had failed to hold them. They reached the megalithic site as the sky turned the color of a faded tapestry. Massive stones, far too large for primitive hands to have moved without celestial intervention or forgotten technology, stood like silent sentinels against the encroaching night. This was the realm of the Nephilim. Elias whispered the verses about the sons of God who had taken the daughters of men as wives, producing offspring that were giants of old and monsters of legend. For Sarah, it was a mystery of engineering. For Elias, it was the physical manifestation of the monsters in his own lineage. He thought of his father, a man of rigid piety who had kept dark, suffocating secrets about their family's lineage, speaking of a blessing that felt more like a heavy, hereditary shadow passed down through the blood. Standing among those stones, Elias felt a shift in perception. He had always wanted the Bible to be a clean, moral guidebook. But here he saw that the scriptures didn't hide the darkness of the world. They documented it with terrifying honesty. They spoke of giants, talking beasts, and celestial violations. He started to accept that the monsters of his own life, the grief for his brother, the silence of God, were part of this larger narrative. They weren't anomalies or errors in translation. They were the jagged, uncomfortable fabric of a reality that was fundamentally broken and waiting for a resolution. They moved toward a collapsed tomb near the edge of the site for shelter. Sarah knelt to clear a drift of sand, her brush moving with precision. Suddenly she stopped, her breath catching. She pulled a small, heavy object from the earth. It was a coin, dull and ancient, dating back to the 1st century. But as she held it to the dying light, Elias felt a cold spear of dread. The coin was stained with something dark and viscous, something that looked impossibly like fresh, wet blood. It was a sign of the most terrifying truth yet, a veil that promised to tear the world asunder. The blood-stained coin Sarah held seemed to pulse with a phantom heat, a physical bridge between the dry ink of history and the visceral reality of their discovery. They retreated from the tomb as the desert wind began to howl, seeking refuge in a small, shadowed room within the walls of Old Jerusalem. The journal lay open on a scarred wooden table, its final pages brittle and heavy with the weight of the last secret. Elias traced the lines of the 5th and most shocking fact. The veil that promised to undo everything he thought he knew about the boundary between life and death. He read the account from the Gospel of Matthew, describing the moment the veil of the temple was torn in two. But it was what happened next that chilled his blood. The earth shook, rocks split, and tombs were thrown open. Many holy people who had died were raised to life, walking into the holy city and appearing to many. To a modern mind, it sounded like a scene from a nightmare, a story of the walking dead haunting the streets of a sacred city. Yet, as Elias stared at the ancient words, he didn't see a horror story. He saw the ultimate redemption of the forgotten. These resurrected saints were the quiet ones, the people whose lives had been swallowed by time and whose prayers had seemingly gone unanswered for generations. Now, they were walking testimonies of a broken reality being mended by a force so immense it could no longer be contained by gravity or stone. He realized that the zombies of faith were actually the first tremors of a world being put back together. The Bible didn't hide the strangeness of existence. It celebrated it as the only honest response to a creator who was far more than a collection of comfortable platitudes. The silence of the room was shattered by the heavy thud of a cane against the stone floor. Elias's former mentor stepped from the darkness of the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He looked at the journal with a mixture of reverence and fear, demanding that Elias hand it over. The old man spoke of the necessity of order and the danger of truths that the common person could not understand. He argued that the 5 veils would only lead to chaos and the erosion of the church's authority. But Elias, looking at the man who had once been his hero, felt no fear. He realized that the mentor wasn't protecting the faith. He was protecting a cage he had built to keep the divine manageable. Elias refused to surrender the book. He stood his ground, choosing to embrace the weirdness and the terror of a God who was wild and unpredictable, rather than the sanitized, harmless version he had been taught to serve. With a final, weary nod of forgiveness, Elias left the mentor behind, walking out into the cool air of the Jerusalem morning with Sarah at his side. They stood on a ridge overlooking the city, watching the sun rise over the Mount of Olives. The curious facts he had chased across continents hadn't made him believe less. They had forced him to see more. He finally found the peace that had eluded him since his brother's funeral. His brother's death was no longer a sign of divine cruelty or a bear-sending God, but a mystery woven into a complex, ancient design that was too vast for any single human life to map. As they prepared to depart, Elias walked to a weathered stone bench and placed the heavy leather-bound journal upon it. He didn't need it anymore. The truth was now written in his own soul. He whispered a final prayer for the next seeker, acknowledging that the greatest miracle isn't the talking animals or the giants, but the relentless human heart that refuses to stop searching for the divine truth in the dark of an ancient and beautiful world today.